Sharon Wife is a behavioral consultant in private practice in Northern Virginia. Her areas of expertise include parent and school staff training in behavior management, specific skill training, and crisis intervention. She has worked as a teacher of special needs children and as program coordinator and supervisor of behavioral intervention programs for behavior disordered children. Sharon speaks nationally on topics such as parenting and behavior management in both the home and educational settings. She consults with private and public schools in Washington, D.C. and the area, and has been on the faculty for courses for the American Academy of Pediatrics, has taught college-level courses on behavior management, and provides technical assistance to area professionals. Join me in welcoming Sharon Weiss to the podium as she addresses structure and behavior management in the classroom.
I appreciate the opportunity to be with you today. A number of you may have suffered through my speaking before, and so some of this will be a little bit of repetition or hopefully updating. But for those of you who have not, I come with the same goal every time I speak, and that is that everyone leaves with at least one new idea or one new approach that they can go back and use in the classroom beginning Monday, or that they can convey to someone to use in the classroom. Coming up with one idea for this group I know is going to be difficult because a lot of you have terrific ideas and are very knowledgeable, and hopefully you'll share those ideas during the question and answer period later today. Before we determine what to do, we need to know what we're working with. These are kids that are very challenging. That's why you're here today. They're labor intensive and they're exhausting. The adolescent presents very much as a double whammy. One, he's adolescent. That's it. That's his handicapping condition. Two, at the secondary level of education, there is so much required in terms of organization and independence, and it often exceeds the capabilities of the ADHD student. Everything I review today can be used with the general classroom population. That is, it can be used with ADHD children as well as non-ADHD kids. If you treat the ADHD student as if he's the non-ADHD student as if he's ADHD, it's not a problem. But if you treat the ADHD child as if he does not have ADHD, that's a disaster. I'm going to review, I said this to Bruce when he stepped down. Bruce stole my thunder in terms of having very excellent behavioral definitions of these kids, apart from the DSM diagnosis. But I want to review some of the behavioral aspects of these kids because you see them, you've got them in your classrooms, and you could probably give me good examples right in your sleep. But first, it's an inability to organize time and space. These are kids who come to school and they have their jackets and they have their books and they have field trip permission forms, but they don't ever have them on the same day. I actually did have a 7th grader identify her locker as the Bermuda Triangle. Things went in, they didn't come back out. They have no internal clock. If this student is doing something he really enjoys doing, and he's been doing it for an hour, and you go to interrupt him, he's incensed by it. Incensed by it. But if he's doing something that's effortful, something that is not intrinsically interesting, often what we're asking him to do, and he does it for 5 minutes, to him it seems like an hour. They do not have a good internal clock. As a result of this, block scheduling can be slow death for these kids. ADHD is a disorder of performance and not skill. Russ Barkley characterizes it as an inability to do what you know rather than not knowing what to do. Now I want to repeat that because it's important. It's an inability to do what you know rather than not knowing what to do. I once had a college student come in to see me, and I don't normally do a lot of work with the kids versus doing the consultation with the parents and the educators. but he was the son of a friend. And what he said to me is, I study really hard, I try and concentrate, I keep having to reread things over and over again. And I'm listening and I'm listening. The dead tip-off to me was when this kid said to me, I went out last week with the woman I want to be the mother of my children, and I could not pay attention to what she was saying. Now here's someone who obviously was motivated and couldn't stay focused on it. He knew what he ought to do. He knew what would look really good to this woman, but he couldn't pay attention long enough. Preaching at them, talking to them about what the rule is, does not really add to their knowledge. In fact, it can be very annoying to both you and to the student. Third, the ADHD child is the one who is unable to delay responding. For this child, immediate gratification takes too long. Whatever they want it right away. That's kind of what Dr. Peffer was talking about when he talked about these kids wanting the extreme sport, wanting to involve in something that's high risk. If they're sitting in your classroom and you have that one hallmark moment where it's quiet, they're bored. They need to crank it up and get some more energy into the atmosphere. The combination of ADHD and adolescence can be absolutely lethal. These are kids that it's hard to tell where the characteristics of adolescence start and ADHD ends, or ADHD starts and adolescence ends. These are children, or unfortunately, they're supposedly adolescents given responsibility to do things, but they seem to be children, and they are often oblivious to the obvious. That is, the necessity of prioritizing, the necessity of focusing at certain times more than others. The societal expectations are difficult for them. They just keep falling short of the mark, and it seems to be intentional, but it's not. It is really important at this point to make the obvious stated. Do not attribute negative motive to their behavior. Do not attribute negative motive to their behavior. Don't take the behavior personally. There's no percentage in attributing negative motive to what they do. From the moment you attribute negative motive to that behavior, no matter, he loves disrupting my class. The moment you attribute negative motive, you're going to become reactive as opposed to responsive. It's going to change your ability to utilize some of the best tools and skills that you have. They didn't develop this behavior intentionally just to get back at you. Trust me, by adolescence, they've been practicing for years on somebody else. Ask the parents, ask last year's teachers, ask anyone you want. This is something that he's had in his repertoire for a while. Most of it dates back well before adolescence, and that's the problem. There's poor social skills that have never been developed. There's a problem of impulsivity, and they have the judgment of a much younger child. So you've got to be very realistic about what you can accomplish when you set out to change the behavior. First, most people do focus on decreasing behavior. Well, actually, that's wrong. Most people focus on eliminating the behavior. And that's not going to happen. One, for the very reason that was stated earlier today, we're not curing these kids. We're, generally speaking, treating the symptomatology. They're going to continue to have attention deficit disorder. You've used excellent strategies in the past. You've had great interventions. But because your mental set was, we're going to start doing this and the child will never do this again, X again, you failed at what you thought was your objective. That was to eliminate the behavior in its entirety. And as a result, you dropped approaches that were excellent approaches. Your adjustment in perspective is going to allow you and this child a lot more success. And that is, you go to decrease the behavior instead of eliminating the behavior. So a realistic goal of behavior change, if you're going to be effective, is that a negative behavior occurs less often, lasts a shorter duration, and occurs at a lower intensity. Any one or all of those things, and you've been successful. Less often, shorter duration, lower intensity. Now, I realize that this is being videotaped for posterity, but I'd like to point out that the handouts follow these slides exactly, in case you're writing like crazy. All right. Therefore, if you consider this success, and you drop the concept of eliminating behavior in its entirety, you're going to be able to appreciate progress, and progress is success. In fact, if you continue to speak in terms of absolutes, and this would be true of any behavior, not just the ADHD child's behavior, the terms never and always should never not be used in conjunction with behavior. Never and always don't apply to behavior. The idea that the child never does his homework is not true. May not do it in your class, but there are times when he does it. Most often the problem is he's doing parts or even all of his homework, but you never see it. That's the never you can use. The more important focus of behavior change is, in fact, that we increase the behavior that we're trying to teach to, or that we teach to a behavior that is not in the student's repertoire. Since they lack organization and time management, often those are the skills we need to teach to, or we've got to find a way to structure so that they can demonstrate it more readily. The question, therefore, if you go to change behavior, if you want to impact on the student's behavior, the question you need to ask yourself is, what do I want him to do instead of what he's doing? If you can't answer that question, there is no chance the student can answer the question. There's no chance he understands what he's shooting for if you can't identify what you wanted him to do instead. I've always wanted to have a bumper sticker that said, if you don't make behavior a priority, it will become one. Don't you think that's pithy? I'm very serious about that. If you don't dedicate time to actual curriculum time, which is limited enough as it is, to providing a structure that's predictable for these kids, to actually reinforcing or addressing behavior, you're going to spend time on it anyway. And it's not going to be good time, it's going to be redirective time. The way we can do this is to narrow the focus. Prioritize your goals, your expectations for them. They are not going to do everything at once. They can't do everything at once. The problem is that their attention is stretched across too many things and they're not good at prioritizing. You have to help them prioritize, and you have to prioritize your expectations for them. What is the 1 to 3 things that they need to do in your class to be successful? You've got to task analyze the expectations. You've got to be very specific about it. It's not enough to say participate in class. You've got to be more specific than that. You have to let them know that you want them to raise their hands and offer an answer. You want to see the hand go up 3 times during the class session. You want to make sure that they can jot down on paper an answer that they had on the basis of a classroom discussion and leave it on the corner of your desk. You've got to really help them achieve the goal you want them to achieve by giving them a mechanism through which they can demonstrate the desired behavior. Because if they focus on doing this for even 1 day and don't get noticed for it, they're going to lose the stamina. They're not going to do it 4 days in a row for you if they didn't get feedback on day 1 when they're exerting all the effort in the world. If they have problems, and there's emerging research that's now being compounded on, that says they are more likely visual learners than auditory learners. So what we have here is that they are responding to their visual, but we're talking at them all the time. We're talking at them in changing their behavior. We're talking at them in terms of having classroom discussions, even the lecture format, which isn't going to work real well. But there's a certain amount of information that you're conveying in a classroom setting by virtue of discussion and lecture. If you want them to pay attention, assign them the role of 1, 2, 3. The 3 of you are going to think up a question to phrase to the class in the last 8 minutes of our discussion. Now, they may not be able to pay attention to all of it, but they'll pay attention long enough to frame that one question, to write down that one question. If you've got 6 of them in your room, assign 3 to ask the question and 3 to answer the question. Don't make the ADHD kid the answer, because he's got to pay attention to the whole thing to get it right. Make him the questioner. Kerwin and Mendler in Discipline with Dignity, they do a wonderful job in there of elaborating on the power of delegating responsibility and assigning roles as a tool to reduce behavior problems. When you give someone responsibility, when you assign roles, it goes a very long way toward reducing acting out behavior. This little technological thing just went black on me. Okay, it's very powerful when students achieve or demonstrate the desired behavior and they are acknowledged for it. You've got to appreciate the small gains. That one clear definition that you gave them of desired behavior has to be acknowledged, at least initially, as frequently as possible. Don't wait for the complete change before the acknowledgement, because the complete change, that end goal, is not going to happen. If you're looking for them to demonstrate a positive attitude in your classroom, don't hold your breath. Their definition of positive attitude and your definition of positive attitude are polar opposites. They think they have a great attitude. You, however, need a major attitude adjustment. You got to specify expectations in advance of the situation. You've got to make sure that when you sit down in advance and talk to them, if you're clear about it, that adolescent who has, generally speaking, the behavior problem in your classroom has been a behavior problem for a long time. And they are now operating under the supposition that the system and you are out to get them. If you sit down in advance of a situation and you have a discussion with them, you decrease the likelihood that they feel like you went after them to get them. Unfortunately, we tell kids what the rules are right after they break them. We wax philosophical about their shortcomings and therefore the reasons for these rules. We respond to these times as if they are teachable moments. They are not teachable moments. Right after you nail a kid's posterior for doing the wrong thing, the only thing he's thinking is, get this adult's face out of my face. They aren't listening to what you say. They don't care what your philosophy of life is, and they really don't care why this rule exists. Remember, it's not a problem of knowing what to do. It's a problem of doing what you know. That's why when you started the discussion right after you nailed their posteriors, they could tell you what the rule was. But the impulsivity or the distractibility got in the way. So having lengthy discussions right after there was a problem is not the best intervention, and public redirection is counterproductive at the adolescent. Actually, I happen to personally feel that public redirection is counterproductive at any age, but at the adolescents, you're talking a face-saving issue. He couldn't come on board. She couldn't follow what you wanted her to do at that moment because it's face-saving. We inadvertently build or compound our own problem by taking an impulsive act and representing it in front of a group as being an act of defiance. You're going to escalate the attitude problem that you were trying to solve. There is so much to be gained by teaching to the behavior and clarifying expectation before the need arises. It doesn't take that long. You make the students aware of the expectations in terms of the behaviors, in terms of specific timelines that you have in mind for academic performance, and your criteria for measuring success for that day. Not for the class, not for the semester, not for the quarter, not even for the month, but for that day or for that week. What it is that you're going to be looking for that student to be doing. Be specific. Notice the successes and ignore a lot of the small stuff. Generally speaking, that happens to be a formula for changing behavior. If they have interim dates for parts or tasks when the project is due, long-term projects are going to kill them, and I know that Dr. Nadeau is going to talk about that. But if they have the interim date, even an interim time, if you're going to assign them something to do in class, put on the corner of the paper what time they should be down to what row, or how much of a paragraph they should have sorted out, or how much of a worksheet complete, so that they have a way to measure. They can beat a time clock. You know, many of you work with people who have the same characteristics. I'm not going to diagnose them as attention deficit disorder, but if you go to them and say, get back to me after you look at this, or look this over, you'll never hear from them again. But if you say, I need this by Thursday, there's a much greater likelihood they're going to come back to you. They need these interim steps. They need these outside tweaks to attention. By adolescents, their behavior and their attitude reflect the fact that they have been caught over and over doing it wrong. In fact, what often happens is a teacher will say to me, well, I told them I'd give them extra time. I offered my assistants if they would just come in and meet with me. But the reality is, and this is one of the few things I lay at parents' feet, the system and parents have taught them not to come in conference with you. Someone made reference to, I don't know why these kids won't come in conference. But if you think about it, many of these students with behavioral difficulties were having behavioral difficulties in elementary school. A note would come home from the teacher to the parent would go in conference with the teacher, and the problem was somehow resolved. The parent would come home and chat about it with the student at home, their child. So the child never had to interface with the teacher over actual resolution of the difficulty. And then we get to 6th grade, and what happens by 6th grade? We have the expectation that they're going to begin going in and conferencing with the teacher, but they have no experience conferencing with teachers over their problems. They have experience that parents are going to conference with teacher over their problems. And they have been, the concept that this inadvertently conveys to them is, you don't have the power or the knowledge or the expertise to be able to resolve this difficulty. And then we wonder why an 8th grade math teacher says, come in and see me afterward, and they don't. Or that they come to you and say, I'm struggling in this class. They're struggling all over the place, but they're certainly not going to admit it to you. In addition to which, even though there are some that would be perfectly willing to do this who are not overt behavioral problems, ADHD is a problem of out of sight, out of mind. They had every intention, as you said, I'm going to be available this afternoon to come in and see you, but then somebody else says, guess what's here, let's go home on the bus together, and we will. And they go. So unless it's part of a structure, unless you come up against it often enough, and unless you build it in as part of what's available to them on a regular basis, they're not going to avail themselves of the assistance that you are often very willing to give. But it's not a matter of not being willing on their part. It's that they honestly believe there's no point to it. And in some cases, they believe it's going to be counterproductive. No one wants to go into a situation they feel they're going to fail. And many of these students feel that their one-to-one conversations with you are only going to point up their failures. So you've got to clarify expectations and provide meaningful feedback that motivates the adolescent to try something that's extremely difficult for him. What we're asking is, we're asking a student to do something that does not come easily to him. The fact is, wrong. Most of these students that you meet by this age have developed this particular repertoire of behaviors as their coping mechanisms for what happens day to day. They're handling their world the best way they know how, in the most comfortable fashion they understand. They would love to get it right. But if what we were asking of them came easily, or if it was in their behavioral repertoire, much more, if it was their idea, they'd be doing it. And you know it. You know that if it came easily to them or they thought it was a great idea, they'd be doing it. Because everything they think is a great idea, they're doing, and that's why we're here trying to figure out how to undo it. So we've got to find a way to increase the likelihood that they would be willing to do something that is either arduous for them, it's not a skill that comes easily to them, or as yet they have not thought it to be a good idea. Therefore, the original question needs to be amended to read, what do I want him to do instead of what he's doing, and what would make it worth his while. By that we mean what reinforcer would be effective. What would make it worth his while to try something that doesn't come easily to him? Now, in the handout, there is a short list, not a comprehensive list, of possible reinforcers. A quick look to focus on a couple. Homework passes are great. A child who comes and brings in 2 pieces of homework in a row, or 3 out of 4 that you're assigning, earns a pass to get out of any homework assignment that it's a one-night assignment. Not a long-term project here. I'm handing him my pass to get out of the quarterly project. No. It's a one-night assignment pass. Being able to teach a lesson with a friend. Let me tell you, if you assign them to teach part of your daily lesson plan, they may not listen to the part you're teaching, but they're going to understand the part they were teaching. And again, it's role and responsibility. Pair them with somebody else in the class who has a good command of it, that's willing to work with them, and let them together teach a part of the lesson plan. By adolescence, the saving grace when I get to talk to early childhood and elementary educators is that at that age, adults are still the most powerful entity in their lives. Not so anymore, folks. You guys aren't even third on the list. The family pet comes between their friends and you. Anytime you can pair them up with a peer mentor, it's a great idea. Somebody else their own age. Peers are the most powerful thing in their lives. Have them develop a contract with you. And I'm not as big on contracts as people think that, behavior management people are. I think contracts are misunderstood, and therefore they're very often used as written documentation of somebody's failures. In fact, what will be effective is that if you have a peer contract, 2 of them coming forward and saying to you, we both want to work on this. If we both make it, we both get the reinforcer. Now, the peer will influence your target child to get through it because they both earn a homework pass or to teach a lesson that way. My absolute favorite reinforcer is to be able to tutor or mentor a younger or less able student. I don't care what the problem is that this student is demonstrating, someplace that student has strengths. And therefore, allow him the opportunity to go into somebody else, sit down with somebody else, and begin mentoring or tutoring somebody else in their own strength area. If there's something I do well which isn't math, and I get some math done, can I earn the right to demonstrate what I do well? I'm trying to think what I do well, with somebody else who can't do that quite as well. I feel good about myself, and the word spreads that I have a strength. The quickest way to impact is to define one behavior and reinforce it with a meaningful reinforcer. You've got to reinforce and notice improvement. Don't expect perfection. Improvement is success. What makes a good reinforcer? Anything the child or the adolescent tries to do, talks about doing, or tries to get away with when your back is turned, that's going to make a great reinforcer. You use a high-frequency behavior, something the child does all the time, to reinforce a low-frequency behavior, something he doesn't do often enough, we want him to do more often. So he doesn't hand in his homework. He doesn't get it done. He doesn't get through to the bottom of it. Then we say, okay, for each paper you get 3/4 of the way through, you get to scratch off the last quarter of it. You don't have to do it. Now, that's apart from a number of academic accommodations that will undoubtedly be discussed by Kathy this afternoon. But the fact is that actually having them earn portions off or out of assignments, which clearly it's problematic for them to focus on for a longer period of time in exchange for getting something down on paper. You need a way to evaluate mastery of the material. You don't need to evaluate mastery of it 45 times. Ask the student what would make a good reinforcer. Find out ask him what he thinks he ought to be working on as a behavior, not just as a reinforcer. What's one behavior you think you need to work on? When you ask them, you find out what they're thinking. I mean, we are constantly telling them what they ought to be working on. But when you ask them, that's the first time you find out what's stuck of all those lectures that we were giving them in the past. What's one behavioral goal you think you'd like to work on this week? And what's a reinforcer that you think would be meaningful? Ask him if he'd like to work with a peer while he's working toward this objective. Find out what his opinion is of doing that. When you make a student part of the solution, he feels less the cause of the problem. Set up a conference with a student. Set up an agreement or a contract, if you will. Ask the student to set a goal. Make sure it's a reasonable goal. They'll say, just like the New Year's resolutions, I can do all of it every day for the rest of this quarter. They can't do half of it 2 days. So if you help them narrow the focus so that their own goals are realistic, even a single project grade may be too much, but the interim objectives of getting a list of books into you, having 2 of them read by a certain date, being able to give you a part of an outline is a way to give them interim objectives and then reinforce their success along that line. That meeting is a 5-minute investment of time, if that. And in some cases, I'll ask, identify, go back and make a list of the 20 students that are of greatest concern to you. And if you were to ask for a meeting with them of 3 minutes apiece. I mean, the amazing thing is that there's going to be a consensus conference at NIMH or NIH on Monday and Tuesday. This is for the great minds, supposedly, that are studying ADHD. They get 15 minutes to talk about what they think is the pithiest things they have to say in their area. And we can't find 1 minute to sit down and talk to these kids about what they think is an objective they could be working on and what would make an effective reinforcer. It will save you an awful lot of after-school conferences with their parents, trust me. In class, ask students for suggestions of activities they could be doing when they're done doing their desk work. Because what you're doing now is they get done taking an in-class test or doing desk work, they start talking to each other, and you nail them for talking and disrupting the class. But if they thought about what they could put on the corner of their desks in a folder to do, and I don't care if it's a copy of Road and Track magazine, to be doing when it's over, then you're not going to have to redirect them for talking and disrupting your class. Socializing with others, most of which was just impulse at the end because they can't sit there and do nothing. The adolescent wants to have a say, we have to let him, we have to ask his opinion. There's a much greater likelihood he'll retain a guideline that he developed. Again, if he's part of the solution, he'll feel less the brunt of the problem. If I asked you to say the most important guidelines that you have for your classroom, the chances are you'd have to give it some thought to come up with what they are, and they're your guidelines. So why would they remember everything you're thinking plus everything they're thinking? I used to, and I've given this example before, I used to have the luxury when I was doing what I do part-time to go into homes and have discussions with kids of what they thought the household rules were. Well, the problem is what we've said to them last, what the last important conference we had with them sort of dictates the rules. So I go into a house and I say to this kid, what do you think your household rules are? I can't run in the house, I have to hang up my book bag, and I can't use the lamps for bowling. This isn't rocket science. It's pretty clear what happened the night before, and therefore it's a new rule in his mind. Now you have to realize this student you have for only X minutes a day. He goes to 6 other people, except for on block scheduling days. He gets their set of rules. Then he goes home and he gets parental rules in spades. So if we want them to maintain the focus, there has to be something to trigger it and make it important to them. And if you ask them to be involved, they more likely can maintain your concept of what they ought to be doing and then bring it to bear at the time. What you can do is to be realistic about what we're dealing with. In that case, it means you have to know the child. Not what he ought to be, and not what you thought he was. There are so many of us in this room that know for a fact they ought to know this by now. They're 15 years old. They ought to be able to do it. Well, they can't. More than 50% of the kids identified with attention deficit disorder have accompanying social skills that make it so they function as much as 3 years to 33% behind their chronological age socially. If they can't even function well in the arena that's most important to them with their friends, why do we think we're going to function well in our classrooms? They're not going to be able to pull it together at that moment. They're going to act childish, they're going to act impulsive. These are problems that they have inherent to a lot of the, at least in terms of the acting out, more hyperactive ADHD students. You've got to know what you're dealing with in order to be able to recognize improvement. The goal is progress, not cure. See where the student functions before you establish the objectives. That way you're going to be able to tell what progress is. Progress may be in terms of improvement in just one class, not in all classes. George DuPaul, in his book on ADHD in education, it's in a what is it, bibliography. But he's one of the ones who makes a very strong case for the fact, try a tool out in one class, see if it works, then try it in all the classes. When we keep expecting performance on all levels, see, sometimes you even conference with each other, find out the child is doing well in one class, and you say, well, then he ought to be able to do it in my class. But that class is a high-interest class, either because the subject matter is high interest or he's connected well with that particular teacher. But when we keep looking at them and demanding of them and lecturing at them that they ought to be able to do it, they know it, we know it by this age that they ought to be able to do it, that we are really frustrating them enormously. Because they already think by this age that they're stupid or falling under expectation. They've been told that before. Now, for those of you who've heard me speak before, although I don't have all of them stashed in today's, I am into pig stories. Never attempt to teach a pig to sing. It's frustrating to you, and it's annoying to the pig. If we keep operating off of shoulds and oughts, we are frustrating ourselves and we're annoying these kids, and they're going to turn off on us. They're going to completely shut down. You have to consider what the student's strengths are, what he's good at. What does this student do well? What kinds of activities does he enjoy? And are any of these activities or any of these strength areas integrated into what we're doing in class? When trying the adaptations on the secondary level, what are already his favorite classes? Go find out from other teachers, other classes in which he's more successful. Then try the technique we want in his high success class with the teacher with whom he's already connected. Because then we tell kids we've got a great idea how to cure them, A, right after they've completely failed, and B, we trot out this great tool in their most difficult area so that we are pushing them to succeed where they are most challenged. If we introduce the tool in a place where they can be successful, they'll like the tool. They'll like the idea. They're willing to try it in more classes. So in fact, don't go into the most difficult class and try it. Try it in the most successful class, or at least where he's got a connection with the teacher. Let him suggest a class he might want to try it in before we try it across the board. What's essential for these kids is structure and predictability. We have to establish routines and make their lives predictable. They have to know what's coming before it gets there. ADHD students don't handle transitions well. Some of the students on my caseload are what I call, in the elementary school, class criers or timekeepers on the secondary level. That is, we give them a timeline. I ask a teacher to give them a timeline at what point we're going to be breaking from one activity and shifting to another, or how far down on a paper you should be by a certain time, and we allow them to either go up and write on the board what they ought to be or checking it off on the board. It gets them out of their seats and moving, and it also gives them a way to key into the time of transition. Establish routines and schedules whenever possible with input from them as to what they think is reasonable, because that's, again, your way to figure out what they think is reasonable. I actually had a student, 14 years of age, this is sort of like the obvious assignment, but he had to read Moby Dick, and he had to read Jaws, and he had to compare the two. I'm not kidding you. I honestly believe, based on his lack of performance for the first month of this assignment, that he was going to take both books out of the library on Tuesday, read one Tuesday night, one Wednesday night, write the paper on Thursday, and hand it in on Friday. And I'd like to point out to you, for ADHD kids, when you have something that's due on November the 14th, as far as they're concerned, counts as a day that you can work on it. It's the way they look at it. So you have to take into consideration that they do need help working this out, but when they fail, if you get in their face about it, they don't want to hear from you anymore. If it's new, if it was something they didn't see coming, it's probably not going to happen smoothly. Truly, practice makes perfect. Daily practice. Make sure the same things are done in the classroom on a daily basis. Do you have the assignment on the same place on the board? Kathy's probably going over stuff Kathy's going to go over. But do you have it on the same place on the board? Do they take it down at the same time every day? I really don't care if she's going to say this. I'm going to say it anyway. Secondary educators must stop teaching 5 minutes before the end of class. Have them take down the assignment as a group, preferably have them exchange assignment notebooks, and then sign off on each other's assignment notebooks, and then make sure that they have a checklist of materials that they are also supposed to take home, because they'll get home with the assignment and not the book. They'll get home without the worksheet. Cut the class curriculum by 5 minutes per day, and make sure, because, you know, one discussion that I heard an adolescent say is that he used to pack up ahead of time so that he wouldn't be late to his next class. It was read by the teacher as disrespect for her material. There's no telling what interpretations put on their efforts to get it right. Document as much as possible in a visual format. What that means is, put it in writing. When you put it in writing, it depersonalizes it. It gives them a way to prompt themselves instead of you prompting them all the time. Think about this. When you give a direction and walk out of the room, what's left behind of your direction? Somebody say something so I know you're out there. Nothing, thank you. Nothing's left behind. If there isn't a visual cue, and often, you know, I don't know how many of you are parents, but often you make the mistake of sending your child up to the bedroom and saying, you know, go clean up your room. They even make it to the right zip code. It's amazing. And then you appear in the door while the child's doing something else, and they go, I was doing it. And you don't even say anything. But you have become the visual cue of what they're supposed to do. If you don't want to stay the visual cue, you've got to use tools to depersonalize it and make sure that it's written down in some other format. You've got to use checklists. You have to use task lists, schedules, and timers. Otherwise, you're going to be the one that he's relying on the same way he relies on his parent to tell him things, and you're going to be the bad guy that tells him things aren't done. I mean, how many times have you given them 2 things to do at their desk? They rush through one, they rush through it so they can get it over with. And then you go and remind them there's a second one. A task list tells them what's going to be expected. A list of what you're going to be covering today in class, an agenda. You had it. You had it when you came in here. We as adults are willing to give an agenda for what's going to be covered to adults, and we don't respect the students enough to give it to them in the classes. But let me tell you something. If you want to know how important that is, you guys have checked that agenda 36 times to find out when you're going to get a break. And I know it. You use a calendar to show them what the assignments are and when they're expected to be due, along with those interim timelines. And it's okay to make a week-long calendar as a sample that shows when parts of it would be due and give it out to everybody. You mean there's going to be a student in the class that's going to fail because you gave them that information? So you run them off and you give them to everybody. You have a checklist of those tasks that they can check off. You have them know that if they get 3/4 of it done, that they don't have to get the last part done. And then you begin working on their accuracy, that they do it at 90% accuracy. When you have them document the sequence, it's predictable and therefore palatable. I actually believe in using a timer on the secondary level. Now, obviously, bells tell when to change classes. And if you can't remember this, the fact is that when you were yourselves in high school, if you were interested in the class, the bell interrupted you. And if you were not interested in the class, you watched that clock and waited for that bell to make that teacher shut up and go away. And that's what a timer does. See, we tell them, we're only going to spend a few more minutes on this, or we're going to be looking over and discussing this material for just 10 minutes. But then to you it seems to be going real well, so you keep on going for 12 or 13 minutes. And I'm telling you that for a lot of these ADHD kids, that discussion wasn't going that well. They really didn't enjoy it as much as you did. And again, I hate to keep bringing it back to your own experience, but you guys think you're getting out of here for lunch at 12:30. If I go to 12:40, you're not going to be happy puppies. When they have an expectation that something's going to be a few more minutes, feel free to use a timer, or one of the ADHD students as a timekeeper to keep you honest about that kind of thing. It helps them understand that the transition will come and that whatever's happening will pass. A lot of us, unfortunately, in dealing with these students, rely on punishment. The problem here is that punishment does not change behavior. Punishment, in fact, does not teach a better way to handle the situation, so it can't change behavior. They have to know what to do instead. Punishment gets them to cease and desist for the moment, and if you're really lucky, it makes them connect their own behavior with the punishment procedure. But most often all they do is connect your behavior with the punishment procedure, or their parents' behavior with the punishment procedure. My mom lost it, I'm grounded this weekend. The teacher doesn't like me, I have to do 3 extra assignments. See, they don't even connect it with their own behavior. The other thing you have to realize is this. Clint Eastwood, as Dirty Harry, says, know your limitations. Got to know your limitations. You don't have a punishment strong enough or powerful enough to even interrupt the behavior, if you think about it. Because by the time this child's an adolescent, especially the more disruptive acting out adolescent, they've been punished with someone with a lot more clout than you have for years. And he who holds the wooden spoon holds the power. That is, that level of punishment, that level of animation, and we hope not physical punishment, is what they consider to be real punishment. What you got pales. And as a result of that, many of these students have developed a very thick skin to punishment. They can tolerate a whole lot more than you can dish out. And the more oppositional ones, punishment sets them off. It exacerbates the situation. It's counterproductive. So before you turn to punishment and redirection, and you're asking the parent to do something about it, and trust me, if the parent could change the behavior, they would have done it by now. If punishment was going to work with your more disruptive student, considering how many times they've been punished, it would have worked by now. And so you have to consider that it's not likely to be the solution to the problem that you have. If you've outlined the expectation, preferably in a visual format, if you've identified a motivator to help sustain the behavior and the effort, if you've talked to them before it's been a problem, if you've asked a question to go and redirect the behavior, it's still going to go wrong with all those things I just said, but ask a question to redirect the behavior. What do I mean by that? Well, a reality is that a question evokes a response, and a statement provokes a defense. And this is chiseled in stone for adolescents. You ask an adolescent a question, he might or might not answer it. You go and make a statement to him, he starts to defend himself. In fact, adolescents hear almost every declarative statement in the world as a judgment. So they're going to defend themselves. They get very defensive about it. But if you say, what is our policy on homework in by, where do we put homework first thing when you enter the class? Allow the ones that are social throughout to keep a pad of paper in front of them to doodle on, and say, what's the one piece thing you have to have out on your desk before we get started with our discussion? Now, you can say, but if he doodles on that pad, if he writes notes, if he does things like that, he's not paying attention. Well, if I really wanted to cut to the chase on this, I'd tell you, but if he doodles on that pad, writes notes, and draws pictures, he isn't disrupting your class. So there's a tremendous advantage. And if you said to him, I want to collect your doodle page at the end of every class, I'd like you to write whatever questions you have about it or observations you have about this class, including that the class today stinks, write on the piece of paper. And just have them hand it in. Writing and giving them something to do decreases how much they speak, talk, socialize spontaneously. And if you say you're going to actually check it, there's a reason why they would put some task-related comments on that piece of paper. When improvement occurs, and it will, if you actually go back and try one or two of these things, not all of them, because all of them is going to be too much, it's too disruptive to you and to them. When the improvement occurs, I want to make you aware that this too shall pass. Whatever's gone right isn't going to stay that way that long. They can't sustain the effort over a long period of time. It's going to need tweaking. It's going to need communication between you and the student. It's going to need those notes home to the parents that things are going better. That would be a novelty for the parent. Things are going better. It's a matter of trends. If the student does better this week, we have success. The one day that's a blip on the screen in the week that's going better is what you learn to ignore. Improvement is success. You can make a difference. The children that challenge, the children that are most difficult and that we can impact on, they're the ones we remember. They're the ones we feel really good about. You build on their strengths. What you have seen today is the work of Mitch. All of my cartoons are done by Mitch, and as I now say, even more increasingly. I'd have more cartoons, but Mitch is ADHD, and he didn't get them to me on time. Mitch is an adolescent. I saw him in my practice, saw him directly. I asked him if he would draw for me, and this is all I asked him. I said, Mitch, do you remember what it was like to be a child with ADHD? And this is what he drew. Even the dog has a comment, and it's not good news. We helped Mitch, and I am happy to say, this is one of the few times I've ever been able to say this, you helped Mitch. He was a Fairfax County student in secondary ed who was failing. He did not go to 7 classes a day. He did make it to 3 or 4. He never, even though I don't use absolutes, made it to 7th, period. And a wonderful counselor, a wonderful system, a lot of creative programming that included giving him 2 art classes a day, one of which was at a different high school, so that one of his periods a day was a travel period. 7th period at another high school was art. And his parents reinforced him with drive time if he made it to 6 classes and made it on time to the 7th. So use of the car was directly contingent on how many classes he attended. And he is in art college. He's not perfect. I asked him on Halloween, Mitch, going down trick-or-treating? Yeah. What are you going as? I'm going as me. I'm pretty scary. Not kidding you. That's what he said. I want to leave, there are no pat answers, there are no easy answers. I want to leave you with 2 quotes. One, I am perfectly willing to admit I stole from Dr. Bruce Peffer, who used this. George Bernard Shaw said, for every complex problem, there's a simple solution, and it's wrong. Dorothy Law Nolt said, if a child lives with approval, he learns to live with himself. Thanks a lot for your time. Have a good lunch.
Dr.